to the Thom Hartmann Program.
And welcome back. Thom Hartmann here with you, 6 minutes past the hour. And why won't PBS release details of a $3.5 million deal with a billionaire? David Sirota is writing these days for Pando Daily, a nationally syndicated columnist, the author of 3 books, most recently Back to Our Future, his website, davidsirota.com. And David, it's always great talking with you. Thanks for joining us today.
Thanks so much for having me, Tom.
So, whoops, I didn't push the button. There, oh, I guess I did. There we go. So what's the deal with PBS? I mean, I think most people think of PBS as like some very high integrity news source, although I've been noticing increasingly, last night Mara Liasson was on Fox News, and when Krauthammer was going, Obamacare sucks, she was grinning from ear to ear. And it wasn't, he didn't literally say that, but close to it. And increasingly, I'm hearing people from the Heritage Foundation and from the Competitive Enterprise Institute and all these, hard right think tanks, Koch brothers funded think tanks, showing up on PBS. But is this part of that, or is this something else?
Well, I think that there's a question of ideology on PBS and throughout the media, and then there's a question of funding and what may be called payola. PBS is ostensibly, at least its brand is, public journalism, publicly funded journalism. And so part of PBS's budget comes from taxpayers through the Corporation of Public Broadcasting. Part of it comes from members making donations, and part of it comes from corporate interests. Right. The last part is the part that's downplayed by PBS and its own branding. But PBS is forced, because taxpayers don't fund it at a really a level that any other industrialized country funds its public media. Our PBS is forced increasingly to go out and try to get money from corporate underwriters for its programming. What happened this week, though, represents something that crosses all sorts of lines, including PBS's own rules and potentially FCC regulations. PBS cut a secret deal with a guy named John Arnold, a former Enron trader who's now a billionaire, who has been financing a multi-million-dollar campaign in state legislatures to slash the retirement benefits for public employees. That's his big cause.
Why would he do that?
Well, I think there's a lot of reasons. I think he's a conservative ideologue. Part of it is that with states facing budget pressures, states are trying to balance their budgets on the backs of pension cuts rather than considering, let's say, tax increases on billionaires,
right,
or ending corporate subsidies.
Right.
So John Arnold is funding this campaign. He is out public about funding this campaign. What he hasn't been so public about, and certainly what PBS hasn't been public about, is that John Arnold is simultaneously and secretly funding a $3.5 million PBS news program, embedded in its news program, mind you, on the NewsHour, called The Pension Peril, which is promoting segments that are all about how we have to cut public employee pensions because they're supposedly bankrupting our states. And CBS is not making an explicit disclosure that he is funding this, segment. PBS has previously, in its rules, not allowed this kind of funding. You can make grants for general journalism, but you are not allowed, if you are a political activist on a particular issue, you're not allowed to also simultaneously fund the PBS programming specifically on that issue. It makes sense as to why. I mean, at one point, one of these segments, I'll give you an example, promoted the California ballot initiative to cut public employee pensions, and they promoted that as part of this series that John Arnold was funding, without not only mentioning that he's funding it, but without even mentioning that John Arnold is also funding the ballot initiative that they were covering. So all sorts of conflicts.
Right. And, wow, that's pretty amazing. Is this just basically PBS selling out because they need the cash?
I think it's a good question. I mean, I certainly think that they need the resources. That's absolutely true. They tailored, according to their spokespeople, they tailored this news program originally because they knew of John Arnold's interest in and his activism on public pensions. And again, there's so many.
Wait a minute. So they knew that this guy wants to smash public pensions because, gee, if we're going to fulfill public pensions, we might have to raise taxes on billionaires or whatever. They knew that this guy didn't like public pensions, and so they came up with an idea for a news story that would trash public pensions and pitched him to it. What's next? They're going to pitch privatize Social Security to Pete Peterson?
That's exactly right. I mean, that was one of the revelations in our story that was most shocking. Arnold didn't come to them and say, look, I want to fund this. I mean, that would be, you'd understand his motivations and you could criticize PBS for accepting the funding. What's worse is that PBS, knowing its own rules against conflicts of interest, said to us that they knew his interest in and activism on pensions and originally went to him with this proposal. And I want to be clear, part of the problem with this proposal, and I don't want to say it's any individual PBS journalist who's working on this, part of the problem is the entire framing of this. The show is called, and the segments that you'll see on the NewsHour, again, undisclosed that Arnold's funding it, is Pension Peril. Notice that it's not, the segment is not called, let's say, Stadium Subsidy Peril, or Corporate Subsidy Peril, or Low Taxes are not generating enough public revenue peril. It's pension peril. Right. Even though states are spending far more on corporate subsidies than the entire pension shortfalls in pension funds are valued at, the ideological skewing of this is to say that pensions are the singular problem with state budgets, and the way to fix state budgets is to cut those pensions.
Well, and here's one other piece to this, David, and that is that a lot of the state pensions, or at least a number of them that I've seen some good reporting done on this, are in trouble in part because they were invested in the stock market, and these Wall Street guys, like this former Enron trader, presumably, I mean, the Wall Street billionaires crashed the stock market in 2008 and then took down a lot of pension funds with it.
That's absolutely right. I mean, the Enron connection with John Arnold, he's a former Enron trader. Enron blew a huge hole in public pensions, and you're right, the 2008 stock collapse hurt pension funds as well. You're absolutely right. And so what's amazing is states have not been funding their pensions. They've not been meeting what they need to put into pensions for years. They've been raiding that money, spending it on things like tax cuts and corporate subsidies. Then Wall Street comes in and blows a hole in the pension fund returns. And then guess what? The solution, according to the John Arnolds of the world, is to simply cut retirement benefits that were promised to retirees.
Right, and let Wall Street keep the profits.
Absolutely. And just one other point about the Wall Street connection. One of the worst stories that's happening on this, I encourage everybody to look at, is Rhode Island. Not only have they cut the pension benefits to employees, but the woman who became general treasurer there, who's now running for governor, moved more and more of the money into high-fee hedge funds. To the hedge fund industry, which of course backed her campaign.
Right.
One of the other things that's happening on public pension funding is that politicians are trying to move more of the funds that exist in pension funds into extremely high fee investments that often don't beat the stock market. But guess what? Those fees finance the profits of hedge funds.
Who then donate money to PBS.
Exactly.
David,
exactly right.
20 seconds left. Has PBS responded to your piece?
PBS is refusing to release the terms of the contract with John Arnold, although John Arnold says he reserves the right to cut off funding in, quote, extraordinary circumstances, which would seem to suggest he has serious editorial influence. He could cut off the funding if he simply doesn't like what PBS is reporting.
Wow. That's grim. And PBS controls the both. Isn't this the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, CPB?
That's right.
Yeah. Okay. So CPB, and they control the TV arm. Do they control the radio arm as well, or fund the radio arm as well?
They fund some of NPR, but this is only on the TV. At least.
So this is mostly the TV side of it. David Sirota, staff writer with Pando Daily. Hang on just a second. Just hang on, David. Back to Our Future, his website, davidsirota.com. David, you're doing brilliant work. Thanks so much for being with us.
Thanks so much for having me, Tom.